If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. A Dynasty Born in Obscurity. Part 1. The Shadowed Origins. Who were the Guptas before greatness found them? Before there were golden coins stamped with a king's face, before there were victory pillars reaching toward the sky, there was just a family with land and ambition, and not much else. The Guptas were not royalty, not in the beginning. They did not come from a long line of famous warriors or gods-touched kings. They were landowners, probably from the merchant or lower noble class, living in the flat, fertile river plains of northern India. Ordinary, by the standards of the time. And this matters, because the world they were born into was messy and wide open. For centuries, a foreign empire called the Kushanas had ruled a large chunk of northern India. But by the 300s AD, that empire was crumbling. It left behind a broken puzzle of small kingdoms, regional chiefs, and local strongmen, all scrambling for power, all watching each other nervously. Nobody was in charge, not really. The Guptas saw this gap, and they were smart enough and patient enough to walk right into it. They did not conquer their way up at first. That comes later. In the early days, they grew quietly. They made friends with the right families. They arranged marriages that brought them closer to powerful clans. They collected small territories the way a careful person saves coins, slowly, steadily, without drawing too much attention. But here is the thing about a family that claws its way up from nothing. They never forget where they started. And that memory does something to a person, to a dynasty. It makes them hungry to prove they belong. It makes them obsessed with looking legitimate, looking powerful, looking chosen by the gods themselves. The Guptas had land, they had growing influence, but what they still lacked was the one thing that separated a strong family from a true dynasty: a story, a grand origin, a reason why they deserved to rule. So they built one, carefully, deliberately, through marriages, alliances, rituals, and court poets who knew which parts of history to polish and which parts to quietly forget. Their real origins, the modest farmland, the unclear caste standing, the slow and unglamorous climb, those details got buried under layers of royal ceremony and impressive titles. This was not dishonesty exactly, it was survival. In ancient India, as in most of the ancient world, a king who could not prove his greatness would not remain a king for long. By the time Samudragupta arrived, his grandfather had already taken the first and most clever step in turning this ordinary family into something extraordinary. He had found a shortcut to legitimacy, and it came in the form of a wedding. Part 2. Chandragupta I's Gambit, a marriage alliance that transformed a chieftain into a king. That wedding was not about love, it was about power, and Chandragupta I knew exactly what he was doing. To understand why this marriage mattered so much, you need to picture what the Guptas were at this point. They were ambitious, yes. They were growing, yes. But in the eyes of the great families and old kingdoms around them, they were still newcomers, still climbing, still proving themselves. And in ancient India, who you were mattered just as much as what you could do. The Lichavis were different. They were old, respected, famous. Their family name stretched back over 800 years, to the same era as the Buddha himself. They were not kings exactly, but they carried something kings envied, a kind of ancient, unquestioned dignity. When people heard the name Lichavi, they did not ask questions. They already knew the answer. So when Chandragupta I married Kumara Devi, a princess from that very clan, something shifted immediately. It was like a man who had been knocking at the front door of history, suddenly being handed the key. The title he claimed after this marriage tells the whole story. He called himself Maharaja Dhiraja, King of Kings. Before the wedding, that title would have sounded like a joke. After it, people listened. But it was not just a title. The Lichavis came with real things: land, soldiers, connections across the eastern Gangetic corridor, the wide, fertile stretch of northern India that runs through what is today Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. This was not empty countryside, it was the heartland of Indian civilization. Whoever controlled it, controlled trade, grain, and the movement of armies. Chandragupta I suddenly controlled a large piece of it. He was so proud of this alliance that he did something almost no Indian king had done before. He put his wife's name on his coins, right there beside his own. Chandragupta and Kumara Devi, stamped in gold, circulating across the empire. That was not tradition, that was a statement. He was telling everyone, this woman's name is part of my power, and I am not hiding it. The child born from this union, or at least raised within its political glow, would be Samudragupta. He did not come into the world as the son of a chieftain from an unclear family. He came into the world as the grandson of the Lichavis. That name opened doors before he ever walked through them. His grandfather had handed him a head start that most princes could only dream of. But a head start is not a finished race, and the road ahead was about to get complicated, because Chandragupta I had more than one son, and only one throne. Part 3. The Chosen Prince. Why Samudragupta was anointed over his brothers. One throne, multiple sons, and a dying king who had to make a choice. Chandragupta I knew what was at stake. The Gupta dynasty was still young, still finding its feet. One wrong decision, one weak heir, and everything he had built could fall apart within a generation. So when the time came, he did not simply follow tradition and hand the throne to his eldest. He looked at his sons, weighed them, and made a deliberate pick. He chose Samudragupta, and he did not do it quietly. He did it publicly, in front of his entire court, ministers, generals, nobles, and every prince who believed the throne might one day be his. The Allahabad pillar inscription, a massive stone column carved with records of Samudragupta's life and deeds, tells us that Chandragupta I declared his chosen son worthy of the kingdom. Those were not empty words. That phrase meant something specific. It meant Samudragupta had earned this, not just inherited it. So what made him stand out? By all accounts, Samudragupta was sharper than his brothers. He had a mind for strategy. He understood how power worked, not just on the battlefield, but in a room full of ambitious men watching each other carefully. He had the kind of intelligence that a fragile, still-growing empire desperately needed in its next ruler. His father could see it, and apparently, so could everyone else in that court. But here is the problem with being publicly chosen over your brothers. Every brother who was passed over now had a reason to hate you. Picture the scene. The king is dying. The court is assembled. Chandragupta raises his hand and names Samudragupta his heir. The room applauds, at least on the surface. But look at the other princes. Their jaws are tight. Their smiles do not reach their eyes. They had grown up in the same palace, trained with the same weapons, and believed perhaps that they were just as capable, maybe more so. The inscription actually hints at this. It describes the other princes with faces wet with tears. Some historians read that as grief over a dying father. Others read it differently, as the barely hidden fury of men who had just watched the prize taken from them in front of an audience. The throne was now Samudragupta's in name, but the men who wanted it were still breathing, still connected to powerful allies, and still very much present in the palace. A public anointing was a beginning, not a guarantee. Samudragupta had been handed the crown. Now he had to actually hold on to it, and the people who wanted to take it from him were not strangers. Part 4. The Court of Rivals, Princes, Jealousy, and the Dangerous Moment of Succession. The palace had gone quiet after the anointing ceremony. But quiet in an ancient Indian royal court did not mean peaceful. It meant everyone was thinking very carefully about their next move. Picture the scene. The hall is full of nobles, military commanders, and princes, all men who had spent years building their own networks, their own loyalties, their own small armies of supporters. And in one afternoon, all of that work had been made worthless. The king had chosen. The race was over before half of them had even started running. The Allahabad inscription, carved in stone centuries ago, tells us that the other princes watched the ceremony with faces wet with tears. That phrase has puzzled historians for a long time. Were they crying because their father was dying? Maybe, but read it again slowly. These were men with armies and ambitions. Those wet faces look a lot less like grief and a lot more like rage that had nowhere safe to go. Not yet. Because here is the thing about ancient Indian royal courts. They were not just families, they were political machines. Every prince had his own group of loyal nobles, his own soldiers who ate his food and took his money, his own allies across the kingdom who expected to be rewarded when their prince became king. The moment Samudragupta was named heir, all of those people had a problem, and people with problems tend to look for solutions. The window between a king dying and his chosen successor fully taking control was the most dangerous stretch of time in any dynasty. It was the gap where rivals could strike, where loyalties could be tested, where one fast, well-organized move could change everything. Samudragupta was young and talented, yes, but talent does not scare men who have armies. What scares them is time. Specifically, not having enough of it before the new king gets too strong to challenge. So the court fractured, quietly at first. Alliances shifted. Conversations happened in private rooms. Men who had smiled at the ceremony began asking careful questions. Who else was unhappy? Who had soldiers? Who was willing to move? Samudragupta had the crown and his father's blessing, but his brothers were still in the palace. Their supporters were still armed. And nobody had forgotten that just days ago, any one of them could have been standing where he was standing. He had been given the throne in front of witnesses. But a throne is just a chair until you can defend it. The real test was not the ceremony. It was what came next. And what came next was not a celebration. It was a fight. Part 5. Blood at the Threshold, suppressing the first revolt and seizing the throne alone. So the brothers made their move. We do not know exactly how it started. Maybe it was whispers in a corridor. Maybe it was a message sent to the wrong general. Maybe someone simply gathered his soldiers one night and decided that his father had made a mistake. But the inscriptions, the stone records carved on Samudragupta's orders, hint at it clearly enough. There was a fight, a real one. Not a debate in the throne room, but an actual armed challenge to his rule. Samudragupta had just watched his father die. He had just been handed a crown in front of the whole court. And now, before he had even settled into power, he had to go to war, against his own family. Think about how that feels. These were not strangers. These were men he grew up with, ate with, trained with, and now they were his enemies. He crushed them. The records do not say how long it took, or how many men died. Court poetry never gives you those details. It is written to celebrate kings, not to count the bodies. But the outcome is clear. When it was over, Samudragupta was the only one standing with real power. His challengers were gone, defeated, exiled, or dead. The palace was his, and his alone. Here is the part that matters most though. It is not just that he won, it is what winning taught him. He learned that when you leave an enemy half defeated, you are not being kind. You are just giving them time to come back stronger. A rival who is still breathing is a rival who is still dangerous. So if you're going to fight, you finish it, completely. No loose ends, no mercy that later becomes a mistake. That sounds cold, and it was cold. But it was also the logic of survival in a world where the moment you showed weakness, someone was already sharpening a knife. He was young when he learned this lesson, and he never forgot it. Every campaign that came after, every kingdom he marched against, every king he defeated, carried the mark of this first brutal education. He would be generous to some enemies, yes, but never in a way that let them threaten him again. The line between mercy and strategy was something he understood perfectly, because he had learned it the hard way, right there at the start, with family blood on the threshold of his own palace. By the time the dust settled, Samudragupta was not just king in name, he was king in fact. The court knew it, the generals knew it, and anyone still thinking about challenging him now had very clear evidence of what that decision would cost them. The throne was his. The empire was waiting. Chapter 2. The Northern Campaigns. Fire across the Aryavarta. Part 1. The First Axis of War. Defeating Achyuta and Nagasena, the kings who dared to resist. Samudragupta did not ease into war. He started with a message. The first two kings he went after were Achyuta and Nagasena. Achyuta ruled a region called Achyuta, a well-known power center in northern India. Nagasena held territory somewhere in the central Gangetic belt. Historians still argue about exactly where, but what everyone agrees on is what happened to both of them. They resisted, and they were destroyed completely. Not captured, not humiliated and let go, destroyed. Their kingdoms were taken apart brick by brick. Their dynasties, families that had ruled for generations, were wiped out. No sons left to claim the throne. No nobles left to plot a comeback. Their lands were folded directly into Samudragupta's empire, governed now by Gupta officials loyal only to Pataliputra. The stone inscription at Allahabad uses a very specific phrase for what happened to them. It says they were violently uprooted. That word choice was not an accident. Whoever wrote that inscription, and it was likely written with Samudragupta's approval, wanted everyone who read it to feel the difference. Other kings in the south would be captured and released. These two were not released, they were ended. Think about what that meant for every other king in northern India who was still sitting on his throne, watching and waiting to see how this young Gupta emperor conducted himself. They saw exactly what resistance looked like. It looked like Achyuta's empty palace. It looked like Nagasena's name surviving only on a stone slab, listed among the defeated. Samudragupta was not just fighting battles, he was sending information. Every king who heard about Achyuta and Nagasena now had to do the math for himself. Was his army strong enough to avoid the same fate? Did he have allies who would actually show up? Or was submission the smarter move? For most of them, the answer was becoming very clear. This was the beginning of what historians call the Northern Campaign, and it was only the opening move. Achyuta and Nagasena were two names on what would become a much longer list. The Allahabad inscription would eventually name 9 kings of the north who were uprooted in this same total, permanent way. 9 dynasties, 9 thrones, 9 family lines, each with their own history, their own armies, their own people, all gone. Samudragupta was just getting started. Part 2. 9 kings uprooted. The systematic destruction of Aryavarta's old dynasties. 9 kings. That is the number the Allahabad inscription gives us. 9 rulers of Aryavarta, the great northern heartland of India, who stood in Samudragupta's path and were, in the inscription's own words, violently uprooted. Not defeated, not humbled. Uprooted, like a tree torn out of the ground, roots and all, so it cannot grow back. Think about what each of those 9 names actually meant. Behind every name was a dynasty, a royal family that had held power for generations. Behind the family were noble houses, ministers, military commanders, landowners, and administrators who had built their lives around that throne. There were forts, treasuries, armies, and tax records. There were marriage alliances with other powerful families. There were centuries of history tied to that one ruling house. Samudragupta erased all of it. This was not how he handled the southern kings. Down south he had fought, won, and then, remarkably, let those kings go. He took the victory, made them acknowledge his superiority, and walked away, leaving them on their thrones. It looked generous, and it was in a calculated way. But up north, no such mercy. The reason was simple, even if the execution was brutal. The south was far, too far to govern from Pataliputra. Installing Gupta officials in kingdoms weeks of hard travel away would have been a nightmare to manage. Letting local kings rule as loyal subordinates was the practical move. It still showed the whole world who was on top, but it did not require Samudragupta to run an empire stretched impossibly thin. The north was different. The Gangetic plain was the empire's beating heart. The rivers, the trade routes, the farmland, the cities, everything that made the Gupta Empire rich and powerful ran through this region. Leaving rival kings alive here, even humbled ones, was leaving lit torches inside your own house. A defeated king with his dynasty intact was a future rebellion waiting for the right moment. So Samudragupta made a choice. He did not humiliate these 9 kings and release them. He removed them permanently, redistributed their lands, installed Gupta governors, and built an unbroken belt of direct imperial control across the entire northern heartland. No gaps, no rival courts, no old royal names that a discontented noble could rally around 10 years later. It was cold, it was total, and it worked. By the time the last of the 9 was gone, the Gangetic plain belonged to the Guptas in a way it had never belonged to anyone before. Not just conquered, but restructured from the inside. The north was now a foundation solid enough to build an empire on. But Samudragupta was not finished deciding who would live and who would fall. Because not every kingdom fit neatly into either category. Some rulers occupied a complicated middle ground, and they would require a completely different kind of answer. Part 3. The Strategy of Annihilation versus Vassalage. How Samudragupta chose who would live. So here is what made Samudragupta genuinely different from most conquerors. He did not just ride from one battle to the next swinging a sword. He thought, he planned, and he had a clear answer to one question that most rulers never even asked. After you win, what do you actually do with the people you just defeated? The answer was not the same for everyone, and that was the point. In the north, the Gangetic heartland, the rich river plains that were the economic and political center of everything, he showed no mercy. Those kings were gone, their families removed from power, their lands taken directly into Gupta hands. Why? Because this was home ground, the core of the empire. You cannot build something permanent on land where old rivals are still breathing and waiting for your back to turn. So he made sure there was no one left to wait. But when his armies moved south, something changed. Southern kings were beaten, humiliated, made to kneel, and then let go. They were sent home to their thrones. Why spare them? Because the south was simply too far away. Think about what it would take to actually run a kingdom 1,000 miles from your capital, across forests, rivers, and mountain ranges, in a time before phones or trains or even decent roads. The cost would eat you alive. A southern king who paid tribute and swore loyalty was worth far more than a southern territory you had to garrison and manage from a distance. This was not weakness, it was math. Frontier regions got yet another treatment. Kingdoms on the edges of the empire, border areas, distant chiefs, even foreign powers from beyond India's northwest, were allowed to keep their thrones as long as they acknowledged Gupta supremacy. They sent gifts, they sent tribute, they used Gupta coins, they did not challenge the empire. In return, they survived. 3 different categories, 3 different answers, all of it consistent, all of it calculated. What is remarkable is that this framework held across hundreds of separate engagements with dozens of different rulers. Samudragupta did not improvise, he applied a system. The north was to be owned completely. The south was to be made loyal but left standing. The edges were to be kept quiet and compliant. Military historians who have studied this period point to exactly this quality as what separated Samudragupta from the rulers who came before him. Winning battles was one thing. Knowing what to do after you won, that was something else entirely. And there was still one more category he had not yet dealt with. Between his northern heartland and the southern kingdoms lay something wild and difficult and easy to underestimate. The forest kingdoms. The people who did not fight like regular armies and did not bend like regular kings. They were next. Part 4. Forest kingdoms and frontier tribes. Bending the Atavika chiefs to imperial will. The forest chiefs were not kings in the way Samudragupta understood kings. They did not sit in grand palaces or command armies that lined up in neat formations on open fields. They ruled the deep interior, the thick jungles and rocky hills of central India, where the trees grew so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground. These were the Atavika chiefs, and their world was as far from the Gupta court as you could get. But do not mistake simple for weak. These chiefs mattered enormously. The forests they controlled sat right between Samudragupta's northern heartland and the southern kingdoms he had already swept through. Any army moving between north and south had to pass near or through their territory. They knew every trail, every river crossing, every place where a large force could be slowed down or ambushed. Their fighters did not need open ground. The jungle was their weapon. Samudragupta understood this. These chiefs could not be ignored. If they stayed hostile, they could cut off his supply lines, harass his armies from the shadows, and make the whole interior of his empire feel unsafe. He could not simply march past them and hope for the best. So he turned his attention to them, but not in the way he had dealt with the northern kings. He did not try to meet jungle fighters in the jungle on their own terms. That would have been slow, bloody, and uncertain. Instead, he applied pressure. He moved his forces into the surrounding regions, made the chiefs feel the weight of Gupta power closing in from multiple sides, and showed them clearly what had happened to the northern kings who had chosen to resist. Those kings were gone, their dynasties were gone, their names were already fading. The message was simple: submit or face something much worse than submission. One by one, the Atavika chiefs bent. The Allahabad inscription records that they became his servants, and that word is important. Samudragupta did not tear out their roots the way he had with Achyuta or Nagasena. He did not erase them. He left them in place, still ruling their forests, still commanding their people. But now they answered to him. They would provide fighters when he needed them, keep the roads safe, and make sure nothing moved through their territory without his knowledge. It was a practical arrangement. He got control of the interior without having to conquer land that was nearly impossible to hold directly. They got to keep their positions and their lives. With the forest kingdoms bent and the northern plains fully crushed, Samudragupta had done something no ruler in generations had managed. The entire interior of the subcontinent, from the Gangetic heartland through the forests to the edges of the south, now moved at his direction. But there were still powerful forces watching from the borders, and some of them were about to make a very careful decision about how to respond. Chapter 3. The Great Southern March, a Conqueror Who Let His Enemies Go. Part 1. Turning South. Why Samudragupta chose the Dakshinapatha when the north was not yet fully secure. So here is the thing about Samudragupta that makes him different from most conquerors you have ever heard of. He had just spent years fighting brutal wars in the north. Kings had been captured. Some had been wiped out completely. The Gupta Empire was growing fast, but it was not fully steady yet. There were still powerful rulers in the north who had not fully accepted him. Any sensible military advisor would have told him the same thing. Finish the job here first, then think about expanding south. Samudragupta did not listen. He looked south instead. The road heading south was called the Dakshinapatha. Think of it as the great highway that connected the northern plains to the kingdoms of peninsular India. And those kingdoms were not small or weak. They had their own armies, their own war traditions, their own fortified cities. These were serious rulers who had been governing their lands for generations. Marching south was not picking an easy fight. So why did he do it? Because Samudragupta understood something that most soldiers miss. War is not just about winning battles. It is about what people believe about you after the battles are over. If he could march south, conquer kings all the way down to the bottom of the subcontinent, and return home victorious, every ruler in the north, who was still quietly thinking about challenging him, would suddenly lose their nerve. The story of what he did would travel faster than any army ever could. He was not just fighting the south. He was sending a message to the north. There was also a practical side to this. Empires are expensive to run. Sending armies far away to permanently occupy distant kingdoms costs enormous amounts of money, food, and manpower. Samudragupta likely knew he did not need to own the south. He just needed the south to know his name and fear it. So his plan was never to plant a Gupta flag on southern soil and stay there. It was something far more clever than that. He would march in, demonstrate power so overwhelming that no southern king could doubt it, and then, in a move that would shock almost anyone watching, let them go. He would release the kings he captured, put them back on their thrones, and ride home. Not because he was merciful by nature, because he was calculating by nature. A king who owes you his throne is more useful than a conquered city that needs guarding forever. And 12 kings who owed Samudragupta everything were about to become exactly that. The march south was beginning, and the list of names that would be carved into stone at Allahabad, 12 kings, 12 captures, 12 releases, was about to be written in real blood on real roads, across the length of an entire subcontinent. Part 2. 12 kings captured, 12 kings released, the policy of Grahana-Moksha-Anugraha. He came to the south not to build an empire there. He came to make a point. Think about it this way. If you walk into someone's house, beat them in a fight, and then hand them back their keys, that person will never forget who is really in charge. That was exactly the calculation Samudragupta made when he marched down the Dakshinapatha with his army. The southern kings were not weak men. They had armies, forts, and proud histories. When Samudragupta arrived at their gates, they had to make a choice: fight or surrender. Most fought, most lost, and then something strange happened. Samudragupta let them go. One by one, 12 southern kings were captured, brought before the Gupta Emperor, and forced to kneel. That moment of kneeling mattered enormously in the ancient world. It was public. It was humiliating. It was proof, carved into reality, that this man from the north held your life in his hands. Then Samudragupta handed it back. He put each king back on his throne, returned his kingdom to him, and rode away. The kings kept their crowns, but everyone knew those crowns now sat on heads that bowed to Pataliputra. The Sanskrit inscription at Allahabad describes this policy in 3 words: Grahana-Moksha-Anugraha. Capture, release, gracious restoration. Say those 3 words slowly, and you have an entire political strategy in a single breath. Here is why it was so clever. Running an empire is expensive. Soldiers need pay, governors need feeding, roads need guarding. If Samudragupta had tried to directly control kingdoms 1,000 miles south of his capital, he would have bled his treasury dry within a decade. Local rebellions would have broken out constantly. His armies would have been stretched thin across impossible distances. But a king who owes you his throne? That king sends you tribute every year without being asked. That king tells his people that the great Gupta Emperor showed him mercy. That king fights your enemies in the south so you don't have to. And that king does all of this willingly because the alternative, another visit from Samudragupta's army, is not a memory anyone wanted to repeat. 12 kings, 12 captures, 12 releases. And suddenly the Gupta name echoed all the way to the southern tip of the subcontinent without a single Gupta soldier stationed there permanently. It was conquest without occupation, power without the price of holding it. The stone inscription at Allahabad lists every single name: 12 kings, 12 kingdoms, stretching down the eastern coast like a trail of footprints left by one man's march across half a continent. And each name on that list is a story of its own, a kingdom that stood in Samudragupta's path and then stepped aside. Those names, and the route they map, tell us exactly where he went and how far he truly reached. Part 3. Mahendra of Kosala to Vishnugupta of Kanchi, tracing the path of conquest down the eastern coast. Start from Mahendra of Kosala. Picture him sitting in his capital, somewhere in what is now the state of Chhattisgarh, hearing the news that a Gupta army is moving south. He was the first name on the list, the first king to face Samudragupta's march down the eastern coast. After Mahendra came Kaviraja of Mahakantara. His name means Tiger King, and his kingdom sat in the thick forests that stretched across central India. Then Mantaraja of Kaurala, whose territory lay further south and east. Each step brought Samudragupta deeper into a part of the subcontinent that no northern emperor had seriously attempted to bring under control in generations. The army moved along what historians call the Eastern Coastal Corridor, basically the long strip of land hugging the eastern side of the subcontinent. Think of it as a highway of ancient kingdoms, one after another, running from the forests of the north all the way down toward the tip of India. Samudragupta followed that path like a man reading a list. Mahendra of Pistapura, a kingdom in what is now coastal Andhra Pradesh. Swamidatta of Kotura, Damana of Erandapala. Each name in the inscription is a real place, a real ruler, a real moment of confrontation, followed by that same act of capture and release. Then came Vishnugupta of Kanchi. His was perhaps the most significant name on the southern half of the list. Kanchi, modern Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu, was not a small border kingdom. It was a major political and cultural center, a city of real weight. When Samudragupta defeated Vishnugupta and then returned his throne to him, he was not just beating a minor local chief. He was sending a message that reached deep into the Tamil-speaking world. The list kept going. Nilaraja of Avamukta, Hastivarman of Vengi, Ugrasena of Palaka, Kubera of Devarashtra, Dhananjaya of Kushtalapur. 12 names in total, and when you plot them on a map, they trace a single curving line down the entire eastern flank of the subcontinent. From the forests of what is now Chhattisgarh and Odisha, through the long coast of Andhra, almost to Tamil Nadu. No Gupta emperor before him had done anything like this. No inscription from this era records a military itinerary this long, this detailed, or this geographically ambitious. But here's the thing about a march this far from home. You eventually have to turn around. The southern kingdoms were captured and restored. The message was delivered. And now Samudragupta had to bring that same energy back north, where unfinished business was still waiting for him. Part 4. The Return and the Reckoning, completing the Northern War after the Southern March. He came back north, and everything changed. Think about what that return meant. Samudragupta had left the Gangetic heartland, the Gupta home territory, while some northern kings were still watching and waiting. Some had already been defeated. Others were biding their time, unsure whether this young emperor was the real thing or just lucky. Then he marched all the way to the edge of Tamil Nadu, and came home in one piece, loaded with tribute, with 12 kings behind him who had knelt and then been given their thrones back as a gift. That is not a general returning from a border skirmish. That is something else entirely. Word travels fast in a world without newspapers, and in ancient India, rumor and reputation were political weapons just as sharp as any sword. Every court in the north would have heard what happened in the south. The stories would have grown in the telling, as stories always do. And so by the time Samudragupta was back on the roads of the Gangetic plain, he was already something larger than a man in the minds of people who had never seen his face. The northern kings who had been on the fence made their calculations. The numbers did not work in their favor. What followed was the final sweep. The Allahabad inscription describes the uprooting of 9 northern kings, rulers of places like Achyuta, Padmavati, and Mathura, who were violently uprooted and their kingdoms absorbed directly into the Gupta Empire. These were not the southern-style captures with gracious restorations. The north was Gupta home ground. Here Samudragupta wanted land, not loyalty pledges. The policy was different because the goal was different. In the south, he wanted prestige and a network of subordinate allies. In the north, he wanted a single, solid, directly governed empire. One by one, the remaining pockets of resistance collapsed. Some kings may have simply surrendered without battle when they saw what was coming. Others held out and were removed. Either way, the result was the same. A continuous belt of Gupta territory stretching across northern India, administered from Pataliputra, answering to one emperor. By the time it was over, Samudragupta had done something no ruler of this region had pulled off in generations. He had not just won battles, he had built a structure, a real, functioning empire with a heartland he controlled directly, and a surrounding ring of subordinate kingdoms that acknowledged his authority. And the world noticed. Not just the kingdoms inside the subcontinent. Powers from beyond its borders started sending messengers with gifts to Pataliputra, asking for favors, offering tribute, because when a king starts to look invincible, even faraway rulers want to be on his good side. Part 5. Frontier Powers and Foreign Courts. Kushanas, Sakas, and Lanka send tribute to Pataliputra. And those messengers came from some very interesting places. To the northwest of India, there were powerful groups called the Kushanas. These were descendants of one of the great empires of Central Asia. At their peak, they had controlled a massive stretch of land running from modern Afghanistan all the way down into northern India. By Samudragupta's time, they were no longer that powerful, but they were still significant. And they still sent gifts and diplomatic letters to Pataliputra. That alone said something. The Sakas of the western coast did the same. These were not small, forgettable tribes. They had been a serious military force in the subcontinent for centuries. Yet here they were, sending representatives to Samudragupta's court, acknowledging that the man sitting in Pataliputra was someone they could not ignore. Then came the message that probably surprised even Samudragupta's own courtiers. A king named Meghavarna, ruler of Simhala, the island we now call Sri Lanka, sent an embassy all the way to Pataliputra. Sri Lanka is separated from mainland India by the sea. Samudragupta had never marched there. He had never threatened them. No Gupta soldier had set foot on that island. But Meghavarna had a request. He wanted to build a Buddhist monastery near Bodh Gaya, the sacred place in northern India where the Buddha had achieved enlightenment, and he wanted Samudragupta's permission to do it. Think about what that means for a moment. A foreign king, ruling an independent island nation, felt he needed to ask Samudragupta's blessing before building a religious structure inside India. He was not forced to ask. Nobody had a sword at his throat. He asked because Samudragupta had become, in the eyes of the known world, the highest authority over the sacred lands of both the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Samudragupta said yes. The monastery was built. That single exchange tells you more about his power than 100 battles. Real dominance is not just about who you defeat. It is about who comes to you voluntarily, hat in hand, asking for your approval. Meghavarna could have simply built the monastery. Instead, he asked. Because being on good terms with Samudragupta mattered, so by the time all of this had unfolded, the northern conquests, the Great Southern March, the return, the subordinated frontier kingdoms, and now these foreign embassies, Samudragupta had built something the subcontinent had not seen since the Mauryas. An empire that was feared, respected, and acknowledged from the mountains of Central Asia to the island shores of Sri Lanka. And yet, inside the palace at Pataliputra, this same man was known to pick up a veena and play music that could move people to tears. That contrast, the conqueror, who was also an artist, is where his story gets truly fascinating. Chapter 4. The Allahabad Pillar, Writing Victory in Stone. Part 1. Harisena, the poet-minister, the mind behind the monument's magnificent language. Now, to truly understand the Allahabad Pillar, you have to meet the man who actually wrote it. His name was Harisena. And he was not just a poet sitting in a quiet room with a lamp and a reed pen. He was simultaneously the empire's chief military commander, a senior minister of the royal court, and the man responsible for managing peace treaties and declarations of war. All three jobs at once. That tells you something important right away. Samudragupta did not trust just anyone. The people closest to him wore many hats, and they wore them because the emperor personally chose them. Harisena was one of those men. When Samudragupta decided that his conquests needed to be written in stone, permanently, publicly for all time, he turned to Harisena. And Harisena did not simply write a list. He composed something closer to a poem wrapped inside a royal announcement. The Sanskrit he used was layered and musical, full of rhythm and imagery, the kind of writing that even highly educated people of the time would stop and admire. Think of it this way. If the pillar was the monument, Harisena's words were the painting on it. He wrote about the kings who surrendered. He wrote about the ones who were captured and released as a show of mercy. He wrote about the distant rulers who sent gifts and ambassadors just to avoid a fight. And he arranged all of it in a way that made Samudragupta feel less like a man and more like a force of nature, something almost destined by the gods to rule. That was not accidental. That was the whole point. Harisena understood that conquest alone does not make a legacy. What makes a legacy is the story told about the conquest. He shaped that story with the precision of someone who understood both war and words, which is probably exactly why Samudragupta trusted him with both. Here is the quiet truth behind all of this. Without Harisena, we would know almost nothing about Samudragupta today. No inscription, no detailed record of campaigns, no list of kings, just fragments and silence. The man who fought the battles needed another man to make sure history remembered them. That partnership, the warrior emperor and his poet minister, produced one of the most remarkable documents of the ancient world. But Harisena was not the only one making a claim to poetic greatness on that pillar. Samudragupta himself had something to say about his own abilities with words, and he was not shy about it. Part 2. Kaviraja, Samudragupta's own claim to poetic mastery and what it revealed about him. Samudragupta did not just let Harisena do all the talking. He had his own claim to make, and he made it loud and clear, right there on the same pillar. Among all the titles he collected, and he had many, one stands out as different. Kaviraja. It means king of poets, not king of warriors, not lord of the earth, king of poets. What makes this title unusual is that he gave it to himself. Most royal titles were handed out by priests, ministers, or tradition. This one, the inscription tells us plainly, came from Samudragupta's own belief about his own abilities. He was not being modest. The inscription says that learned men, scholars who had spent their whole lives studying language and verse, could not match him. Now, powerful men have always said flattering things about themselves. That alone does not mean much. But here is what makes it harder to dismiss: the gold coins. Samudragupta had his coins made with great care. Each type told a story about who he was, and one type showed him sitting, completely at ease, holding a veena and playing it. Not standing over a fallen enemy, not on horseback, sitting, playing music. Think about what it means to choose that image for your money. Coins traveled everywhere, through markets across borders, into the hands of merchants, soldiers, farmers, and foreign traders. That image was his message to the world. Not just "I can destroy you," but "I am someone who creates beauty." This tells us something real about how the Gupta kings thought about power. Winning wars was necessary, yes. You needed the army, the campaigns, the submission of other kings. That was the foundation. But a king who only had force was in their eyes just a strong man, temporary, forgettable. What made a king eternal, what carved his name into history rather than just into stone, was the ability to master culture. Poetry, music, philosophy, art, patronage. These were not soft extras. They were the proof that a king belonged to a higher order of human being. Samudragupta wanted to be remembered as both. The man who could defeat you in battle, and then, in the same afternoon, compose a verse that made scholars fall silent. Whether he was truly as brilliant a poet as he claimed, we cannot fully know. None of his poetry has survived on its own. But his gold coins have survived. That veena is still there, struck in metal, 2,000 years old, still carrying its message. He built his empire with weapons, but he chose to define himself with music. That choice reveals more about him than any list of conquered kings ever could. And the conquests themselves, the full staggering scope of what he actually did on the battlefield, were about to be set in stone for all of history to read. Part 3. The Ashvamedha, reviving the ancient horse sacrifice to crown the conquest with sacred legitimacy. The wars were over. The kings had either bowed or been broken. Samudragupta had done what almost no ruler in Indian history had managed. He had swept across the subcontinent from the Himalayas to the far south and come back undefeated. His name was known everywhere. His army was feared everywhere. But winning battles was one thing. Making people believe your rule was meant to be, that was something else entirely. So Samudragupta reached back into the ancient world and pulled out something that had not been seen for centuries. The Ashvamedha. If you had never heard of it, here is what it was. A specially blessed horse, the finest, most sacred horse the emperor owned, was set free to wander wherever it wanted for an entire year. No rope, no direction, no walls. It just walked. And behind it, every step of the way, marched the imperial army. The rule was simple and terrifying. Wherever that horse walked, it was claiming that land for the emperor. If a local king let it pass, he was saying without a single word that he accepted Samudragupta as his master. If he stopped the horse, if he blocked its path or turned it away, he was declaring war against the entire Gupta army standing right behind it. Most kings, naturally, let the horse walk through. This ritual was ancient. The oldest scriptures in the Hindu tradition, the Vedas, described it. But by Samudragupta's time, no major Indian ruler had actually performed it in hundreds of years. The knowledge existed, the text survived, but the ritual itself had gone quiet, almost forgotten. Reviving it sent an enormous message. It told the priests, the Brahmins who carried enormous social influence, that this emperor respected the oldest sacred traditions. It told the common people that the gods themselves had looked down and approved of what Samudragupta had built. It told rival kings and watching nobles that his conquests were not accidents of battle or luck. They were written into the cosmic order. Politics and religion became the same thing. And Samudragupta did not leave that message to memory alone. He minted gold coins, beautiful, carefully made coins, that showed imagery connected to the Ashvamedha. These coins moved through markets, passed between hands, crossed borders. Every person who held one was holding a small piece of the announcement. The empire was not just a military fact, it was a sacred reality. This was a man who had already told the world he was a warrior. He had told them he was a poet. Now he was telling them something bigger, that heaven itself stood behind everything he had done. And to make absolutely certain none of it would ever be forgotten, there was still one more thing waiting, something carved in stone. In language so precise and so beautiful, it would survive 2,000 years and still be readable today. Part 4. Gold coins and their grammar. How the archer, lyrist, and battle axe types each told a story. Imagine you are holding a small gold coin in your hand. It is about the size of your thumbnail. It is heavy for its size. And on its surface, pressed into the metal with extraordinary care, is a picture that tells you exactly who is in charge of the world. Samudragupta did not just mint coins to pay soldiers and buy grain. He minted coins to send a message. Every coin type he released was a different sentence in the same long speech, a speech about who he was, what he had done, and why the gods approved of all of it. The archer type showed him pulling back a bow, strong and focused. No words needed. You looked at that coin and you knew, this man fights, and he wins. The battle axe type did the same thing in a different way. It connected him to the ancient warrior kings of India's oldest stories. It said, I am not just powerful today, I come from a long line of power. Then there was the lyrist type. This one was different. No weapons, no battle pose, just the emperor, seated, fingers on the strings of a veena, playing music. That image on a gold coin, traveling through markets and across borders, was the Kaviraja identity made real and touchable. A warrior who also played music was not soft, he was complete. The standard type showed him standing in full royal clothing beside the Garuda symbol, the great bird associated with Vishnu. This told every person who held that coin that their emperor was not just a man, he was a devoted servant of a god. His power had a sacred source. And the Ashvamedha coins tied everything together. They reminded anyone who handled them that this emperor had performed the horse sacrifice, the most powerful royal ceremony in the ancient Indian world. Heaven had been invited to approve, and heaven had not said no. What made this so clever was the medium itself. Stone pillars could be read only by people who walked past them. Proclamations could be heard only by people who were present. But coins went everywhere. They passed through the hands of farmers, merchants, soldiers, priests, and foreign traders. Every single one of those people received the same message, again and again, every time money changed hands. Samudragupta was not just building an empire. He was building an image of an emperor, one that was warrior, poet, priest, and God's chosen man all at once. And he built that image out of gold, in pictures small enough to fit in a closed fist. The coins traveled far. But the words written about him, carved deep into a tall stone pillar, were designed to travel even further. Chapter 5. The Veena and the Vedas. Architect of the Golden Age. Part 1. The Emperor Who Played. Samudragupta's devotion to music and its meaning in an age of war. Picture the most feared man in India, a king who had just spent years marching his army across the entire subcontinent, defeating king after king, burning his enemy's pride into the dust. Soldiers trembled when they heard his name. Kingdoms sent him tribute just to avoid his arrival. Now picture that same man sitting quietly, cross-legged, fingers resting gently on the strings of a veena. That was Samudragupta. And he did not keep that image private. He put it on his coins, the small gold discs that moved through every market, every hand, every corner of his empire. The most powerful man in India chose to show himself, not with a sword raised, not on a war elephant, but making music. That is a strange thing to do if you think about it. Why would a conqueror want people to see him as a musician? The answer is that in ancient India, being only a warrior was not enough. A great king was supposed to be a complete person. Not just strong, but wise. Not just brave, but cultured. The ideal ruler was expected to master war and art, both. One without the other was considered half a person. Samudragupta took that idea seriously. He was not dabbling. Historical records, including the famous Allahabad pillar inscription, describe him as a genuine poet and musician. Someone praised by experts, not just flattered by servants afraid to disagree. Think about what that took. This was a man managing armies, administering a vast empire, performing ancient religious rituals, and receiving foreign ambassadors. He somehow also found the time and the discipline to become truly skilled at a difficult instrument that took years to learn. That combination, the general and the artist living inside one person, was exactly the point. The gold coin was not decoration, it was a statement. It said, "I have done what a complete human being is supposed to do. I have mastered the hard world of war and the inner world of art." His subjects would have understood that message immediately. A king who only conquered was a dangerous man with power. A king who also created was something rarer, someone who understood beauty, who respected the mind, who carried the full weight of what it meant to be human. Samudragupta was building more than an empire with swords. He was building a vision of what an empire should be, and that vision, a place where music, learning, and greatness could exist together, was about to take on a life of its own at his court in Pataliputra, drawing some of the most brilliant minds of the ancient world toward its light. Part 2. Patron and Philosopher. Fostering Brahmanic learning, Buddhist scholarship, and the arts simultaneously. Pataliputra was already a great city, but under Samudragupta, it became something else entirely, a place where the sharpest minds on the subcontinent wanted to be. Think of it like a flame, and scholars, poets, priests, and philosophers were all moths flying toward it from every direction. Samudragupta spent generously on Brahmanic learning. He funded Vedic rituals on a grand scale. These were the ancient religious ceremonies that had defined Indian civilization for centuries. Complex, expensive, and deeply tied to the idea of righteous kingship. By performing and sponsoring them publicly, he was sending a clear message. This king stands with the old traditions, with the sacred, with order. But here is the part that makes Samudragupta genuinely interesting. He did not stop there. When a delegation arrived from Lanka, the island kingdom we now call Sri Lanka, with a very specific request, he did not turn them away. They wanted permission to build a Buddhist monastery at Bodh Gaya, one of the holiest sites in the Buddhist world, the very place where the Buddha had reached enlightenment. Samudragupta received them with respect and said yes. This mattered enormously. Buddhism and the older Brahmanical traditions were not the same. They had real theological differences. A king who only cared about keeping one group happy might have chosen sides. Samudragupta did not choose sides. He understood something that very few rulers in history ever figure out. When you are king over millions of people with different beliefs, the most powerful thing you can do is make all of them feel seen. Not tricked, not managed, actually respected. By protecting every sacred tradition, he became legitimate in every community's eyes at once. His court reflected this same wide openness. Poetry was taken seriously there. So was music. So was philosophical debate, the kind where learned men argued about the nature of reality and the meaning of the scriptures, and nobody thought that was a waste of time. These were not separate hobbies, existing alongside the real work of empire. They were the work of empire. Or at least, Samudragupta treated them that way. What he built at Pataliputra was a model, a living example of what a great civilization could look like when power and culture walked together instead of in opposite directions. His son would inherit all of this: the court, the culture, the habits of mind, the tone of generosity and curiosity. And his son, Chandragupta II, would one day be called Vikramaditya, meaning son of valor, standing at the top of what history would remember as the golden age of India. But before any of that could happen, an empire needed more than music and philosophy. It needed structures that could hold everything together, even after the man who built it was gone. Part 3. The Administrative Architecture: How Samudragupta Built an Empire That Could Outlast Its Founder. That question, how do you keep an empire together, is one the greatest conquerors in history have failed to answer. Samudragupta had one answer, and it was smarter than almost anything that came before it. Think of India at that time like a giant patchwork. In the middle, the Gangetic Plain, the richest, most populated, most important stretch of land. Around it, hundreds of kingdoms, chiefs, tribal leaders, and foreign rulers, each with their own armies and loyalties. Ruling all of it the same way would have been impossible. So Samudragupta did not try. In the core, the heartland along the Ganges, he ran things directly. His governors, his officials, his eyes and ears, these were places he owned completely. And his administration made sure taxes flowed in, roads stayed open, and order held. The inscriptions from his era list titles and offices in detail that tells us this was not a loose arrangement. People had specific jobs. There was a system. But further out, where the land stretched toward forests, mountains, and distant coasts, he did something different. He let local kings keep their thrones. He let frontier chiefs keep their armies. He even accepted tribute from foreign rulers beyond his borders. What he took from them was not their power. He took their loyalty and their public submission. This was the stroke of genius. Instead of trying to govern everything from one palace and burning out trying, he built circles. A tight inner circle he controlled completely. A wider ring of kings who owed him everything. A still wider ring of rulers who simply acknowledged that Samudragupta was the biggest force on the subcontinent. Each layer held the next one in place, and if any one chief rebelled or stopped paying tribute, Samudragupta did not have to conquer the whole subcontinent again. He only had to deal with that one problem. The rest stayed in line. This was not the work of a man who just liked fighting. This was the work of someone who thought carefully about the morning after the battle, about what makes power last. Empires built only on fear tend to collapse when the feared man dies. What Samudragupta built was different. It had structure, it had layers, it had people invested in keeping the whole thing standing because they were part of it. His son would one day walk into a court that already worked, an empire that already had its bones in place, and a reputation that already made foreign rulers nervous. Chandragupta too would not have to build from nothing. His father had already done that part. What came next was something more like a flowering, and the seeds had been planted with tremendous care. Part 4. The Seeds of Vikramaditya, Preparing Chandragupta II to Carry the Flame Forward. Samudragupta had spent decades building something, not just an empire, a living, breathing system that could carry weight even after he was gone. And now, near the end of his reign, that system had a name waiting to step into it. That name was Chandragupta II. Think of it like this. Most powerful rulers leave behind a mess when they die. Wars break out, sons fight each other. Old enemies smell weakness and come crawling back. But Samudragupta had watched enough history to know that trap. He refused to fall into it. His son grew up inside one of the most remarkable courts the ancient world had ever seen. Not a court of just soldiers and spies, though those were there too. This was a court where poets argued with philosophers, where music was taken as seriously as military strategy, where the right way to perform a Vedic ritual mattered as much as the right way to cross a river with an army. Chandragupta II did not just watch this from a distance. He was shaped by it, every single day. The empire he was about to inherit had real bones. The heartland along the Ganges was directly controlled, firmly held. Around it, like rings on a tree, sat kings who paid tribute, chiefs who answered when called, and foreign rulers who sent gifts to stay on the right side of Pataliputra. The whole arrangement was stable, not because everyone loved the Guptas, but because everyone understood what disobeying them had cost others. Samudragupta had also given his son something harder to measure, but just as powerful: a story. The Ashvamedha horse sacrifice had declared to the whole subcontinent that the Gupta kings stood in the tradition of the ancient rulers, blessed by gods, chosen by heaven. The coins stamped with the king playing his veena told the world that this was no ordinary warlord. This was a complete man, a complete king. Chandragupta II would one day push the empire even further west, smash the last pockets of foreign power holding trade routes along the Arabian Sea, and preside over a court that would produce Kalidasa, perhaps the greatest poet in the history of the Sanskrit language, along with Aryavarta, a mathematician and astronomer so far ahead of his time it still feels slightly unreal. But none of that flowering happens without the roots, and the roots were Samudragupta's work entirely. He handed his son not a broken kingdom struggling to survive, but a confident empire ready to reach even higher. That, in its own way, may be the most impressive thing he ever did, more impressive than any battle he won or any king he made kneel. What his son did with that gift is a story worth telling. Part 5. The Undimmed Standard. Why history named him the Napoleon of India, and whether that name is enough. So, about that nickname, the Napoleon of India. A British historian named Vincent Arthur Smith came up with it in the 1800s. He meant it as a compliment. He was saying that Samudragupta was the kind of military genius who only comes along once in a very long time. And on that point, he was absolutely right. The comparison makes sense on the surface. Both men were brilliant on the battlefield. Both were more than just soldiers. They were thinkers, patrons of art, and builders of power that stretched far beyond what anyone before them had managed. When you look at the two side by side, the similarities feel real. But here is the problem with the comparison. Napoleon's empire fell apart while Napoleon was still alive. He died in exile, watching everything he built crumble. His legacy was spectacular, yes, but it was also broken. Samudragupta's story ended very differently. Everything he built kept standing. His son Chandragupta II took the empire and pushed it even higher. The Gupta period that followed became what historians call the classical golden age of Indian civilization, a time when art, science, literature, and philosophy all reached heights that are still studied and admired today. That didn't happen in spite of Samudragupta. It happened because of him. Calling him the Napoleon of India is a little like calling a master architect the best builder on his street. The compliment is real, but the frame is too small. Samudragupta was a man who fought wars across thousands of miles, then sat down and played the veena. He built an empire, then made sure it could survive without him. He was a king who understood that real power isn't just about how much land you can take. It's about what you leave behind when you're gone. What he left behind was 150 years of one of the greatest civilizations the ancient world ever saw. He doesn't need Napoleon's name to make him impressive. He was already something the world had rarely seen before. A conqueror who was also a creator. A warrior who was also a poet. A king who was also, in a very real sense, an artist shaping history itself as his canvas.